Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, research director of the same project. Good late morning, after morning, Josh.
Oh, thanks. Yes, it is.
Well, there's a lot on the agenda today in a lot of ways. Let's start with local developments, I think. A couple of things interesting in the news in Texas government and politics, and then we'll move on to the re-eruption of Donald Trump in the news.
Yes.
I mean, it was a shallow eruption in the sense that he's never far from the surface. But nonetheless, we'll get to that in a sec. But yesterday, an announcement late yesterday that they were scheduling a gubernatorial debate between Greg Abbott and Beto O'Rourke. The details seem to be moving a little bit. I mean, some of the basics are in place. I think the not entirely confirmed date for the one debate that they are scheduled as of now is September 22nd. Not surprisingly, at University of Texas RGV in Edinburgh. Interesting decision, but there's been a lot of focus on the border area. Yeah. An easy thing for them, probably among the easier things for them to decide on. I say that until proven wrong.
One of the easier things probably for both sides to agree to.
Yeah, right. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Showing my age, maybe. A lot of the familiar response here to what seems to me to be what should be a pretty familiar political play right now. That is, the Abbott camp is sort of trying to dig in on just doing one debate. The O'Rourke camp wants more debates. I mean, I think you were mentioning
more town halls. I think they want 3 town halls.
Yeah, more. And even and I like that because even calling this a debate is kind of silly to dig up another thing that comes up every time, right? They're not really debates per se. So, and I think you had said you had read in some of the coverage, and I don't think I saw this in the stuff I read, but that Governor Abbott's political consultant, Dave Carney, was saying, well, we might consider more, left the door open a little bit. I think that's, as we were saying before the podcast, probably pretty unlikely unless something really fundamentally changes in this race. Yeah,
I mean, I think even his response was a fair amount of posturing in a way that I think, a political professional does that sort of sets up, well, whatever we decide, it's because we're in an advantageous position, so why would we do anything? And ultimately, that's right. The underlying strategy here. I mean, there's no reason for Abbott, with the lead that he has, to give O'Rourke more time for there to be, the possibility of, unscripted questions or even, more pointed questions from town hall members. And so, right. I mean, if you're Abbott, you want to follow the trajectory and, but I mean, to your point, I think there is this sort of, this happens all the time and it's always surprising me, but whenever an election comes around, it's like, it's as if the last election or 2 elections ago never even happened in some cases. And this is the point. I mean, I think also pretty clearly in the coverage, this is a pretty long tradition in Texas politics, the Friday night singular debates. Yeah.
I mean, I would probably modify it. It's not, there's a divide between, the coverage, within this, usually the first day or 2 days of the announcement of a debate like this, it swings back and forth from a certain tone of, we should consider this news in isolation. And then, frankly, older, more experienced reporters or commentators go, oh, no, this has happened before. And, so there's like and I think, the key points here kind of, the first time this happened, as I recall, back in the mid-2000s when Perry was governor and running for re-election was, they're doing it on a Friday night of football season, and everybody thinks, that sort of masquerades as, I know Texas,
right.
High school football night, nobody's going to watch. I mean, and then, the arguing over how many. And as you say, campaigns make decisions on this to comparative advantage.
And both are, and ultimately, ultimately Abbott doesn't need to agree to any more debates than he wants to. And, I think he's shown what he wants to do. And for O'Rourke at the same time, there's an advantage to saying, look, he doesn't want to debate me.
Right, which is
making kind of hay out of the fact that, this is a big state, all these things. And, and so both sides have an advantage to play here, and they're playing it. And, we're kind of paying attention to it this week. But,
And that's, I think that the point about not wanting to appear like they don't want a debate is why Carney is kind of, publicly hedging, but not in a big public way. It's a way of trying to shape coverage, and et cetera, et cetera. And look, on the football thing, look, almost everything to be said about this has been said, which is why we have to flag it. We should flag it, but it's a very different media environment than the first time that, the incumbent tried to, deflect attention from the debate by having it on a Friday night during high school football season. In streaming world, it's not as if anybody who wants to see this isn't going to see it.
I'm not trying to...
And there'll be tons of, coverage of this in other ways. And I think it comes out in the wash.
And not to show my ass here, but I mean, ultimately, I think the fact that it's on a Friday night period is the bigger effect than the fact that it's on Friday night during high school football season. I mean, because ultimately it's just like, look, I follow this for a living. Do you think I want to sit down on Friday night and watch this debate?
I don't.
Absolutely
but you will.
Not, but I will. Okay.
But again, probably,
I mean, no, I will. I will. But I mean, but this is the whole thing. I mean, so it kind of is what it is. I mean, generally speaking, in the media, we know in politics, when do you dump stuff you want to dump? Well, you dump it on Friday night. And so, but you're right. I mean, ultimately, at the same time, this isn't like this is going to be like people aren't going to have a chance to watch if they don't want to. It's not like the campaigns aren't going to repackage moments from this and put it in ads and put it in web ads. It's not like there won't be tons of coverage of it. So
and we've talked about this. Even that Friday thing, I think, doesn't hold quite as much. As it used to. I mean, people still do it, but it doesn't work as well as it used to.
And far fewer than every adult Texan or every registered voter is going to be watching this debate, regardless of what night it is.
Whenever they have it.
So
another local story I wanted to flag that I think came up a little, came up last week, but has been unfolding in an interesting way, and that's the ongoing attention to the Abbott administration's tactic of
policy,
offering bus rides to migrants that are, essentially, awaiting hearings to other parts of the country, particularly, to Washington, D.C.
And now New York.
And then late last week, they expanded it to New York. And there's been an ongoing kind of running fight for a couple of weeks now between, in public, between Abbott and the mayors of New York and Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. And then this week, there's more public fighting. The relatively new mayor of New York, Eric Adams, now saying that he wants to bus volunteers to Texas to campaign against Abbott. Now, that's a pretty gestural, kind of move, but it really underlines the degree to which, this busing thing is something that the Abbott campaign is hanging on. It was a really big applause line at the CPAC meeting in Dallas Abbott spoke last Thursday, right after we did the previous podcast. Mm-hmm. And for people that don't know what I'm talking about, that's the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is put on by the American Conservative Union, I think Matt Schlapp's group. Met in Dallas. Trump spoke. We'll return to that in a minute. But Governor Abbott did an onstage appearance, kind of an interview with some folks there, in which, the big applause line he got was when he mentioned the busing, his busing thing and a couple of, other things related to immigration and border security. So, this is, the busing effort is such a non-policy and such a purely political gesture. Mm-hmm. I think it does point to a lot of things that we talk a lot about on this podcast. Obviously, the salience of immigration and border security to Abbott's voting base, their desire to be talking about that and to have press coverage of that, other than other things that are not breaking the Abbott administration and the Abbott campaign's way, like Uvalde and abortion, et cetera, other things that are contenders from a Democratic perspective. Mm-hmm. But it's also really, the purely gestural nature of this is really pretty striking because there's really, and I don't think the governor has really even, or his defenders have even tried. It's one of those things that reminds me of, you're going to laugh at this. It reminds me
maybe
of,
if I know the
Oliver
reference.
North testifying before the Iran-Contra committee and them trying to, the committee members in the Senate trying to hold his feet to the fire. And him saying, well, when we realized we could sell these weapons to the Iranians and then use that money to help fund the Contras, it was kind of a neat idea, right?
Yeah.
There's a certain kind of, brazen, in that case it was, it was illegal, but who cares?
Well, and I think
in this, it's kind of, this is such a, this is, purely a, a mischievous gesture that's causing other problem. It's, it's almost at the level of a prank.
Yeah.
With real human cost to the people. You're literally using these migrants and using people and causing policy problems for other people. That's pretty brazen.
Yeah, well, but
I don't know what else to call it. You can call it a lot. I would come up with a lot of other things to call it. But it really underlines, just the latitude that the administration and the Abbott campaign team feels in pursuing this, this kind of agenda in terms of the intersection of, I'm going to say the intersections of policy and politics, but the policy piece is sort of an empty set.
Yeah, I think, like your analogy, it probably does sound like a neat idea in the short run and that it does accomplish something. The question is, to me, what does it look like in the long run? They could, if they decide that there eventually becomes some kind of a broader cost to this, it's easy enough for them to stop. But, in the short term, I think the politics of this look pretty good for Abbott, to be honest, because really what do you have? You have, mayors from overwhelmingly Democratic and generally kind of liberal cities basically saying, we don't want to deal with your problem. And Abbott says, see?
Right.
Exactly.
No, I get it.
And so, I know you get it. I'm just saying. So, I think in the short term, I think the politics of kind of the sniping that's going on, probably plays pretty well for Abbott. I think it plays well with his voters. I think it plays well with, let's say the cable news set. I think it's a good space for him to be in. And probably, and I've said this before, I don't, setting this aside, we're not going to talk about this, but whether or not Abbott wants to run for president, I think one of the advantages that he has had over, and setting aside Trump for a second, but one of the advantages that he maintains over DeSantis is that Texas does have a 1,200-mile border with Mexico, and he can directly do things in the immigration space that DeSantis can't. At the same time, because it's such a vacuous stunt, really, the question becomes, to my mind, I think especially locally, do people look at this and see it as that eventually, right? In the sense that, the state, we've been talking about this, but the state keeps spending more and more money on border security. And eventually, it's sort of we're kind of getting to the point of blank check territory for how much the state is going to spend on this stuff. But just like everything else, if we were spending $800 million, 5 years or 7 years ago, right? And it was this terrible, terrible problem. And now here we are 7 years later and we're spending $4 billion and it's this terrible, terrible problem. It wouldn't be unreasonable for even Texans who are, pretty conservative about, their view on immigration in some way to say, hey, what are we getting for this money?
Right.
And if part of what the most visible manifestation of that is, well, we're busing migrants to New York City on a free bus trip, it just doesn't, I just don't think it looks great in the long run.
There's a certain amount of shiny object to this that, you're picking on the big city guys.
I don't hold that strongly, but I do think, I'm not sure that, again, the neat idea in the moment isn't, in the end, something that they're going to kind of walk back from and not walk away from. I mean, walk back from it, just walk away from when it becomes less valuable.
Right. And in terms of thinking about what, a response would be to this, there has been a fig leaf of a policy justification, which is, and the governor has said this directly, that the migrants that are being held in the region are overwhelming local services, local, resources. And so he's saying, so we're shipping now, they're shipping, 40, 50, 60 people at a time, busloads of people. There haven't been, 1,000 buses or anything like this. So, just to have, but I think you're right. This is, there's a shallow politics to this, but I think the other thing about this, and this is a good transition to our next topic, is that shallow politics,
it might work. I would just say,
work in the short term until you move on to the next thing.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't want to mischaracterize this, and again, I won't even call it a busing policy, but I think there is something of a danger of treating an issue that you unequivocally treat and your voters treat as so serious and so important, like a joke.
Yeah.
And that's the only, there's just a certain disconnect there.
But I think the way that you're talking about it, look, there's it's an open question what the threshold,
or like a prank rather.
Yeah, right. What the threshold is going to be. I think there's just enough. It pushes just enough buttons.
Yeah.
To probably, if they were doing it in a vacuum, but they're able to pivot to, hey, we're doing other things as well now. None of those things are also. The other piece of this is that it's not to talk so much about, not to speak so directly to the seriousness of the problem, but it's doing something in a context of, as we've said on here a lot of times, a problem that is proven over a long period of time to be intractable.
Right.
And so, almost doing anything, it almost distracts from the intractability of the problem.
Maybe.
Now, there's a certain action for action's sake here on top of the prank level, but
yeah, the only thing I just add is, I think, on an issue that Republicans have such an advantage on, I don't think, you want to play too long in being seen as unserious.
Right.
Right. And that's the only, I think, there's such an advantage where, I think a lot of people in Texas, would say, almost all Republicans, a lot of independents, and not, insignificant share of Democrats, if they were just voting on the immigration issue, are going to vote for the Republican, whoever they are, because there's so little trust in the Democrats. But if you start to turn it into a prank, or you start to mismanage that, and as the funds go up, there's more scrutiny, more attention, ultimately, I think you do create more exposure for yourself there. I don't think it's determinative. I don't think a bunch of people are going to walk away and say, you know what, forget this. But I do think, you do create some potential costs.
I think the implication for that is, you go a couple of rounds with this and then move on.
Yeah, I would think so.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, that tactic of doing something that would seem to be, prankish and not serious, but then moving on, has been proven successful by some people, some prominent cases in the political system recently.
Well, and in Texas.
Which leads us to the big national political story of the week, which is, the Monday FBI search of parts of Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago property. And we're learning more, this just happened Monday.
Yeah.
It didn't really even break till Monday afternoon while the search had been underway for several hours, broken by a reporter in Florida, and then sort of transmitted more broadly by Trump himself as he, in Trumpian fashion, tried to kind of define the story with a tweet that talked about this as, tyrannical and, unfair, and they broke open my safe and, I'm being persecuted, et cetera.
Right.
And to anticipate, a broader theme here, because we're going to talk more about implications than the thing itself. The thing itself is, being beat to death without a whole lot of information. There's more Trump news as we record this on Wednesday morning that's just breaking. And that is that Trump has taken the fifth in his testimony in New York on a whole other legal matter that has to do with his financial practices and
valuations of property as represented to investors and others.
And that's been going on for quite some time. And he was forced to testify in this after trying to evade that. But on the but going back then to the fallout from this FBI search at Mar-a-Lago, it dominated and is dominating the news and is leading to all kinds of fallout and teasing out of the implications. I think one of the things you have to notice is that thinking about one of the things that we've talked about a lot here, I think it even came up last week. In terms of where Trump is in the Republican universe, where Republican attitudes are towards Trump. It was a testament to just how differently partisans see Trump and see the world and, what the reflexes still are, particularly among GOP Republican elected officials, and to be fair, Democrats.
And last week we were reacting to basically sort of this, the after some primaries, the coverage is really focused on this sort of refracted view of Trump power in the party, which is like, how successful is he in putting this thumb on the scales in these primaries? But here we have something that's like much more direct, right?
Right, and we saw, and we got, I think we backed into a measure of that, right?
Yeah, right.
The response among many GOP leaders was very fast,
right.
On Monday night, and then into Tuesday, in a way that appeared, whether it was or wasn't, almost reflexive. I mean, there wasn't a lot of evidence that it took most Republican leaders a lot of time to do the math.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, including people that are, have been emerging tentatively to some degree in recent months as potential rivals to Trump for the nomination in 2024. So, you top that list with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who, within hours of the operation was slamming the quote unquote raid in his home state as, quote, another escalation in the weaponization of federal agencies against the regime's political opponents. Now, a lot of language in that really, we saw repeat again and again, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, we saw, in addition to Ron DeSantis, obviously, if we look to Texas, we saw people like Ted Cruz wrote, several tweets comparing the Biden administration to the Nixon administration. We saw John Cornyn explicitly, endorse. I mean, he made clear that he was explicitly endorsing a tweet by minority leader Kevin McCarthy, warning the Attorney General Merrick Garland to clear his schedule and to, maintain his documents for hearings, assuming the GOP wins control of the House.
Right. McCarthy, we should add, bucking pop back to the national,
right.
Really trying to make sure he protects his position and, what looks to be his opportunity to be the next speaker.
Right. And that's, I should say, it's notable that, how quick he was on that, given the fact that, again, the sort of most recent thing that, I would say he's been in the news for sort of his appearance in the January 6th hearings, again, at the use of the committee making pretty negative statements about Trump's actions around January 6th. And so, it's not surprising, although he's hedging himself, certainly. Governor Abbott took a similar approach. He called it next level Nixonian and saying, quote, this weaponizes power to squelch dissent.
Yeah, and there was some odd phrasing in that Abbott tweet, and I don't want to get too into a textual analysis of a tweet in a non-visual medium, but it's worth looking at that tweet. I mean, that was one of the tweets that didn't look entirely reflexive. That looked like it was a little bit written by committee, but and I think one thing that is it's very interesting just how quickly the hyperbolic response to this caught on among the right. And again, to be uniform about this, the barely concealed glee among Democrats, and particularly, kind of the MSNBC crowd, kind of left cable, left media about, or, center left, I should say, about this that's, very provocative, and given how little we know, probably, pretty over the top.
For both sides.
Right. Now, I mean, again, be careful about false equivalency. I mean,
yes,
the characterization on the right that this was, a tyrannical raid is clearly not based in the facts of the situation. There's evidence of, or there seems to be evidence of, the expectation that this was heavily vetted, given Justice Department procedure. In the Justice Department, probably, this has not been confirmed, but probably up to and including the Attorney General.
Right.
This went before a judge.
Right.
A judge issued the warrant.
Right.
So there was a lot of procedure behind this. Now, we're all adults. One might look at procedure, find flaws in the procedure. It happens. But this was not, somebody just deciding, okay, it's time to go bust down, bust into Mar-a-Lago and start rummaging through the place.
No, I mean, I think if anything, based on both recent history and what we know about the policies of the FBI and the Justice Department, I mean, this was probably a decision taken with a lot of reticence and a lot of vetting, because ultimately, I mean, if you kind of take a step back and say, does the FBI want to be doing this? Absolutely not, right? I mean, does the Justice Department want to be involved in Donald Trump's business or politics right now? Absolutely not. And truthfully, if you look at the fallout, I mean, if you imagine some really amazing cabal and it goes all the way up to Biden, and Biden is, is this really having the effect that you want it to have? Because ultimately it's galvanizing the right behind Trump. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the, at the shallow level of just vying for attention. I mean, Joe Biden was, signing the CHIPS Act yesterday, and they're trying to take some victory laps and build some momentum after some pretty decent congressional wins and, slightly better economic. they're coming out of a hard spot and
I'm
trying
sure
to
the
guide
Biden-
media coverage. This is not really what
The
they're
Biden
after.
political team was not happy about this, I'm
Right.
sure. But anyway.
But that's, not, yeah.
But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
For a non-fact based
Sure.
approach to this, however you parse all that out, once again, all eyes in the American political world are on Trump, on his past, on his future.
Right.
There's a few things to, I think, unpack here. I mean, most obviously, this illustrates for the umpteenth time just how much gravity Trump still exerts in the political universe. Even at a time when we thought, there were people theorizing that might be receding a little bit.
Yeah, or that, other people may be moving. I mean, there's sort of this interest in the last couple weeks about other people maybe moving into the space a little bit, occupying a little bit more, of Republicans' minds.
And again,
at the
I think people
national
might have, jumped a little, might have been a little bit
hasty
in that. I mean, and we've talked about that. His favorability numbers in Texas, for example, are still pretty good.
Yeah, I mean,
think, pretty good among Republicans, put it that way.
Well, and that's the thing. I think, there's this sort of on the one hand, kind of continuous analysis of Trump's impact on the current electoral cycle.
Yeah.
Right. And that's sort of its own thing relative to, what his prospects are in 2024. Right. I think. And I think people are kind of, they're sort of treating them as the same. They're not exactly the same thing. Some other things that I think kind of jump out from this.
Yeah.
And I said this to you before, but there's a certain aspect to this where, in the way that we think about things, and if you listen to this, you kind of get a sense of this. It's sort of like in the immediate aftermath, there is sort of a question like, what should I look at here? How do you contextualize this? And, you brought up one thing. I'll bring up a couple. One that I'll go back to that you'd already mentioned is, it sort of does illustrate either, and I don't know which, either the political calculation or the lack of political calculation that was exerted, especially by Trump's defenders, when so little is known about the underlying rationale for the search warrant. Right now, I think, as we're recording this, there's still this sort of question of look, Trump's lawyers have the search warrant. They could turn it over or make it public and let people know what this was actually about. And they're choosing not to, at least currently. And I think, if that's the way that they proceed, I think that's, telling in some ways. But ultimately, as we've kind of laid out, nobody who's jumping to Trump's defense doesn't know that, what we've kind of talked about the underlying context here about, the vetting that would have to go into this. So on the one hand, there's sort of what's amazing is the lack of political calculation. Without knowing exactly what the FBI was doing, the supporters are certainly taking a fairly clear risk that Trump did do something, pretty problematic here, whether legally
Trump supporters,
whether legally or politically, right? At the same time, there's part of me that kind of has been watching this for years and think, well, I don't know, maybe this is very well politically calculated and it was easy because whatever ends up happening, it's not really going to impact attitudes anyway. And we've kind of seen that in our results about January 6th, in our results about, the outcome of the 2020 election and whether there was an accurate outcome. Ultimately, nothing has shifted the underlying views as more and more information has come out amongst Republicans. So ultimately, the whole, I could shoot somebody in front of Fifth Avenue thing, that just seems to have been proven more and more accurate.
Yeah.
And so that may be very calculated.
No, I think that's right. And I think that, at this point, and I get, we should mention, and we haven't, that, the prevailing, sort of understanding of this that has been sort of semi-confirmed by at least the Trump lawyers and some of the more recent coverage this morning was that this was related to the removal of official documents, records, some of which might have been,
could be classified
and a potential security risk by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
When he moved out of the White House and into Mar-a-Lago. This is not, the first we've heard of this. There have been meetings. And as it turns out, the Justice Department representatives, including counterintelligence people, had already met and reviewed some of the documents that they had in their possession. So there's not much question about that. And I think in a way that's part of the rationale, it seems to me, for his legal team and legal/political team not releasing the warrant, just to spell that out, not releasing the warrant because it enables his supporters to imagine that there's a nefarious purpose instead of a legally laid out.
Yeah, once we know what the what the FBI removed more or less, ultimately it sounds to me like at a very basic level, it sounds to me like these were boxes of documents that are not his to possess.
Right.
And ultimately, the government took them back.
Yeah,
kind of at a basic level. Now, are they going to go ahead and charge him with something? From what I understand, under the presidential, the Records Act, you could be charged with, up to 3 years in prison. Nobody says, I don't think anybody really suspects that's going to happen.
Right.
With just respect to them, taking the records. But ultimately, I don't think anybody could justifiably say that the government's records that he took and kept in his basement at Mar-a-Lago are his to keep when they're so clearly not.
Right. And that's by
but just anyway.
law. Right.
So, just some other takeaways, right? I mean, this sort of continues this widespread degradation of views towards just American institutions, but especially among, I think, the GOP public and GOP elites, right? This plays on negative attitudes towards the federal government. It plays on ideas about a deep state that I think people are very, especially elites are very, very clearly highlighting. And increases, negative attitudes towards the FBI, actually, which, if you may recall, already had pretty negative attitudes among Democrats because of, their actions going into the 2016 election and beyond. And so, it's on the one hand, I always say this, it's playing on attitudes that are already there and it's inflaming them. And it's not like this is hard, but it's something, this is why I think it also picked up so quickly is because when it sounds true to people, it's easy enough to mobilize that.
Well, and it's, it speaks to where we started to some degree and which, we were just talking about, which is that, that degradation of views about American institutions is pretty far advanced.
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent that, the quick reactions to Trump were not just about Trump, it was an anticipation of what the context of that response was going to be. Again, particularly among Trump supporters and the sort of burgeoning, major elements of the Republican electorate right now. And then I think it also, that feeds into this discussion that we've been having about political violence. We've talked about that polling that we've done in here, more than once. And we have seen, a lot of that in the last 24, 36 hours. Very, very quickly, there were tweets and posts on right-wing boards that have been now covered in the press and that have been all over the place about, time to lock and load. The idea that this was basically an extrajudicial proceeding, which it clearly was not. Right. And so I think, we've talked about it. It gets us, it really keys into that and furthers that in a kind of vicious cycle. You were talking about, this is not new. These are pre-existing attitudes, but we're in a real vicious cycle about this right now. And look, it underlines the degree to which, that is a symptom of the larger problem here to my mind that, Trump is a corrosive agent in American politics. And, to the extent that sounds partisan, I say that from an institutional view, not a partisan point of view. He's cultivated a conspiracy-minded response among both elites and voters alike. I think there's been I've been reading, I'm not even going to go there, but, the response on right-wing radio and social media was, a renewed parade of calls for civil war, fighting the deep state, et cetera. And it's, you kind of mentioned the January 6th committee hearings. We've just gone through some, we're going through a very painstaking process of unpacking the impact of that kind of rhetoric, those movements, and tapping into that as a means of mobilization by mainstream political figures. And, this is moving us, backwards. Now, Trump supporters will say that we have it all backwards.
Yeah.
Right? That it's the use of the police power of the state against the former president, who is likely the preferred candidate of millions of voters, that's violating democratic norms and processes. And, look, that political, there's a kernel of something in there that's fair to consider.
Sure.
But I think as you implied, you implied earlier, it's naive to think that this was not part of the calculation on the part of the Justice Department and the FBI.
What?
What the appearance was going to be and that this was going to be the counter response. But they were kind of in a box on this, I suspect.
Well, and this is part of the sort of, it's sort of like a higher order or even more abstract degradation of, not only, institutions, but norms. It's sort of like, well, and I kind of go back again. I don't know what's in the boxes. I don't know anything about it. Right. Basically, what I think is probably true is what I say, which is, they're most likely boxes that are full of documents owned by the federal government, right? The basics of that, just the federal government going back and taking these boxes back, right? In and of itself, you say, okay, is that a good rationale to have rhetoric about a civil war, about telling people to lock and load, about, even, more horrible and more direct, stuff online. And then also elites, really traipsing in rhetoric that touches on a lot of those themes when, again, as you point out, watching the January 6th committee hearings, knowing like this rhetoric matters, and that's the thing. It's not as though we can say, oh, we don't know what's going to happen if people keep saying that, well, the elections are sham, you can't trust the police.
The federal government is illegitimate. All these institutions are inherently corrupt and broken.
And also directly, and this is the thing, and, we need to fight. And that's the thing. You go back to CPAC and you're talking about, a conference defined by this idea of like, we are in a battle. I mean, Ted Cruz talks about putting on his breastplate every day, and Trump is talking about how great it is for right-wing leaders. It'd be a big anyway. Right-wing leaders, who are executing drug dealers, and how we need to get tougher and all this. Yeah. And it's like, I mean, just as someone who's kind of sitting here who watches this stuff, and just trying to be, I'm just like, I think people need to be a little bit more careful.
And, something I did, in the mailer I sent out last week, and for people that aren't on that, you can go to our website. We do a fairly regular mailing, that sometimes touches on stuff in the podcast, sometimes other things, just kind of rounds up, brings data to bear on recent events in Texas. But I mean, all of those things you just described have become pretty normalized.
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent to where, Viktor Orbán can speak to CPAC, and this is the Hungarian prime minister, who is kind of the avatar of sort of reactionary ethnic nationalism and authoritarianism within democratic systems in Europe. And people, kind of noted it and moved on.
Yeah.
Nothing
unusual here.
Right.
Not even nothing to see here. Nothing unusual here.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Have a look and that's who that is. Yeah. You're remembering that, right? That is who that guy is. So, I think we're in all of this puts us in a bad place, for all the things we're talking about. Back to the more mundane sort of factors of this, before we take off. I mean, I think that to bring it back to what's going on in Texas, the fact that Governor Abbott, Senator Cornyn, Senator Cruz reacted so quickly and in the way they did, really underlines how this is a national problem, but it is manifest in state politics and in governance in the state and in the political environment in the state. So, these larger institutional problems of norms, problems of democratic practice are also our problems.
Yeah. Very much.
And so we will, we'll continue to keep an eye on this. It'll be interesting to see how much, how long people want to ride this horse. As you say, what else comes out, around this. But,
one thing
unless somebody leaks it, I'm not, I'll be surprised if we see the Trump folks releasing that warrant.
Well, and the other thing is, this seems like it's going to be another one. I mean, unfortunately, and again, I think, one of the things is the normalization of this kind of stuff is problematic. Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to say, but one of the things that would be nice, but almost very hard to imagine is the FBI or the Justice Department explaining in some kind of satisfying way what it was doing.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that's not really kind of the norm for these sorts of things.
No, and that's where, the political strategy on the part of Trump and his lawyers, are no doubt playing on that.
Yeah.
As
long as they don't define it, they can define it however they want.
Right. I mean, Merrick Garland has made a point of saying that he is not going to sign off on or make the kind of public pronouncements that, say, Jim Comey did in a political context when he was head of the FBI. So they have a structural that is an advantage that they have here, and I expect them to continue to play that. Meanwhile, we will have these themes mobilized in the national consciousness, and it will be interesting to see how they continue to play out. I mean, to tie it all together a little bit, we were talking about, what the Abbott campaign is latching on to try to keep attention away from areas where they are more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And all things being equal, I think this probably helps them in that effort. I mean, it's not anything they
fits the bill
engineered, but they'll certainly be happy to have some of the other things that have been in the headlines in the state, particularly the continuing fallout from Uvalde. And I should flag, we haven't even mentioned this. CNN did an hour-long special Sunday night on Uvalde that was very negative towards Abbott and in particular towards Steve McCraw. And, I haven't seen much discussion of it, and I don't think it's been made, as of now, it hadn't been made available on the internet.
Yeah.
But to be honest, they would be fair in feeling like it was a hit job.
Okay.
There was nothing factually incorrect that I detected in that.
Yeah.
But the emphasis on using TV conventions, on repeatedly showing the clip of Abbott's first pronouncements about the police bravery and heading into the fire. A lot of, fairly excruciating footage across the first couple of weeks of Steve McCraw and the emerging sort of, how fairly early on, they were blaming local authorities with little discussion of DPS. That is still just brewing out there.
Yeah.
And, it's, from a completely, tactical perspective, it's no surprise that the Abbott campaign really wants to not be talking about this anymore, and that we'll take anything not to. So with that, we're a little over. Thanks for being here this morning. Thanks to our excellent production team in the audio studio, in the Liberal Arts Dev studio at the University of Texas at Austin. They are a terrific group of young folks here. Thanks for listening, and remember, you can find all the data we've referenced today, much, much more at the Texas Politics Project website. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu, and we'll be back as soon as we can with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.